1985 in Ontario, California, a city located 40 miles east of Los Angeles. Her parents, who owned a small manufacturing business in town, never had a ton of money, but they always had enough to make ends meet. Growing up, Michelle's parents taught her and her younger sister to always put their all into whatever it was they were involved in, whether it was academics, athletics, or relationships. They also taught their daughters to always take their Christianity very seriously. By the time Michelle was in high school, she had made her parents very proud, becoming one of the top students in her class, and also becoming a very talented cross-country runner. But despite these early successes, Michelle never bragged about them. Not because she was trying to stay humble necessarily, but because that was just her personality. She was a very private person who did not seek the spotlight. After high school, Michelle attended Dickinson College in Pennsylvania on a scholarship, and then after graduation, when Michelle was just 22 years old, she married her high school sweetheart. However, that relationship would not last. When they divorced just 4 years later, Michelle was upset about it, but she was confident that she was going to be okay. She was still very young, she had the full support of her family, and she had a good job that allowed her to be self-sufficient. All she needed to do was to be patient and wait for the right partner to come along. And in 2013, roughly a year after her divorce, it seemed like the right partner had. In August of that year, Michelle connected with a U.S. Marshal named Ian Diaz on a dating website. The U.S. Marshal Service is the federal government's primary agency for fugitive investigations. Shortly after Michelle and Ian connected online, they met in person for the first time over a cup of coffee. At 35, Ian was 9 years older than Michelle. He was tall and fit. Michelle was slender with dark hair and deep brown eyes. They both had great smiles, and right away they hit it off. That first cup of coffee was quickly followed by text messages, phone calls, and arrangements to meet again. On just their second date, Ian blurted out, "I love you," to Michelle. This definitely caught Michelle by surprise, but she was thrilled. As a child, she sometimes fantasized about being a princess and having her Prince Charming come along and whisk her away. And suddenly it seemed like that actually was happening. Over the next several months, the pair would continue to see each other on a near-daily basis, and then in the spring of 2014, they moved in together, and then in December of 2014, Ian took Michelle on a trip to New York City where he asked for her hand in marriage, and she would say yes. Michelle was on cloud nine. Ian really was her Prince Charming. Once they were engaged, Michelle threw herself into planning their perfect future together as Mr. and Mrs. Diaz. However, cracks began to appear in their relationship. Michelle would later say that Ian had pressured her to take a $20,000 pay cut to leave her job that she loved and take a marketing position at a place he loved and had once worked himself, Disneyland Resort in Anaheim, California. She also said that Ian began asking her to wear more revealing, sexier clothes, and he wanted her to get acrylic nails and get her belly button pierced. It wasn't Michelle's style, but since she didn't want to disappoint her future husband, she would, from time to time, put on the crop tops and short skirts just to make him happy. But despite doing that, Ian never really did seem happy, and eventually he would open up to her about some of his deeper sexual fantasies. He told Michelle that what he really wanted to see was her having sex with other men. At first, Michelle was stunned and said, "No, absolutely not." But despite her refusal, Ian brought the subject up again and again, each time with a little more insistence, and then finally, Michelle agreed. On Valentine's Day 2015, with enough cold medicine and alcohol in her system to lower her inhibitions, Michelle had sex with a stranger that she believed Ian had recruited on Craigslist. What Michelle didn't know was that Ian had filmed the entire sexual encounter, and then afterward, he wanted to watch it with her. Michelle was horrified. She begged Ian to destroy this video, but Ian refused and said, "No one forced you to do it." But despite these huge issues in their relationship, they did not cause the couple to end their engagement. In fact, these issues only seemed to bring the couple closer together, if for the wrong reasons. As Ian became more and more controlling of Michelle, Michelle became more and more emotionally dependent on Ian. And so with that in mind, in June of 2015, 8 months before their wedding date, Ian and Michelle took out a mortgage together and they moved into a brand new 2-story condo in downtown Anaheim, California. It was Michelle who came up with the entire $14,400 down payment, but she didn't care. She and Ian were both so excited about a change of scenery to hopefully get their relationship back on track. Just weeks after moving in, all of the excitement of the new place was gone, and in its place were all of their old unresolved issues. Soon, minor disagreements became major arguments, and major arguments turned into vicious accusations of infidelity and betrayal. Finally, the fights turned physical. When Michelle threatened to leave, he held her down on the bed while she tried to kick and claw her way free. Families on both sides of the warring couple had the same advice. You are not good for each other. You need to end it. So at the end of August, just 2 months after Ian and Michelle had purchased the condo together, Ian took back the engagement ring he had given Michelle, and Michelle packed up her Volkswagen Jetta and drove off to stay with her parents. But as much as Michelle and Ian now wanted out of their relationship, as long as they owned that condo together, they could not entirely sever ties. Michelle wanted Ian to sell the condo so she could get reimbursed for the down payment she had made, but Ian liked the condo and had no intention of moving out. This put them at a sort of standstill and kind of forced them to continue interacting despite being broken up. And surprisingly, through their somewhat regular exchanges over this property, they learned how to be cordial again. Ian would text Michelle first about the property, and then he would follow up and ask how she was doing, and Michelle would do the same thing to Ian. Even though this did not get them anywhere closer to solving their condo issue, it seemed like they were at least at a point where they could treat each other with respect. However, this would not last. On September 10th, so 1 month after Michelle had moved out and when the condo issue was still completely unresolved, Ian received a very strange and upsetting message from Michelle. In between friendly, cordial text messages, Michelle sent him a long, bizarre, rambly email that could only be described as biblical in her condemnation of the man she once wanted to marry. She wrote, "Your sins are many, including defiling me and my family with your wicked and evil sexual acts, your financial coercion and irresponsibility, your gluttony, your greed, your lust, your sloth, your wrath, your envy, and most of all, your pride." She finished it with, "You may try to hide behind the law of man, but it is a weak shield that will bend and crack against the sword of God. I will bring the full force of the law and the word of God against you to judge you." Ian knew that Michelle and her family were religious, and he knew from their relationship that Michelle was prone to emotional outbursts. But even by her standards, this email revealed a vengefulness that he had not seen before. Ian was so shaken up by it that the very next day, on September 11th, Ian filed a restraining order against Michelle. After reading the email and speaking with Ian, the judge did not grant the restraining order against Michelle. However, Ian's request had now brought Michelle to the notice of the Anaheim police. Shocked that she had even been the subject for a restraining order, Michelle immediately hired an attorney to handle all interactions with Ian, and Ian would hire an attorney as well. And by November of 2015, the lawyers were finally able to work out a compromise with the condo that would allow Michelle and Ian to finally move on from each other. The deal stated that Michelle would not get back her $14,400 down payment. Instead, she would continue to pay half the mortgage for 6 months. But after that, Ian would either assume full responsibility for the mortgage, or he would have to agree to sell the condo and split the profits with Michelle. Even though neither side was fully happy with this arrangement, they both were just exhausted from all the fighting and were ready to just accept it and move on. And so they both signed the agreement, and then the 6-month timer began. Ian stayed in the condo, and Michelle, who was living with her parents, decided to get her own small apartment and go back to school to get her master's in business. In January 2016, just a month or so after the condo settlement was finalized, Ian Diaz met another young woman through a dating site. Her name was Angela Connell. She was roughly the same age as Michelle, and she was looking for a serious relationship. When she and Ian finally met in person, they both liked what they saw. During their first date, Ian was honest with Angela and told her that he had just recently gotten out of an engagement that had ended very badly, but he was still certain he wanted to get married and raise a family, which was very reassuring to Angela. Only 1 month later, Ian and Angela would get married, and Angela would move into Ian's condo, the same condo he had bought with Michelle. In May, just 4 months after meeting Ian and 2 months away from the deadline for Ian to assume paying the full mortgage on the condo or sell the property, Angela surprised her husband with a sonogram and announced that she was pregnant with twins. The couple was beyond excited. They sent copies of the sonogram of the twins to family and friends, and Angela wasted no time prepping their home for the twins' arrival. Everything had moved quickly, but the couple was very excited at the prospect of starting a family together. Later that month, on May 22nd, Angela was at the condo alone when she hopped on her computer to check her email. Once her inbox loaded, she noticed there was an email from a man named Jason Ray. She didn't recognize the name, but at first glance, it looked like a real email from a real person, not some spam message. So she clicked on it to see what it was. And the words she read sent a chill through her body. The email was definitely not spam. It was a personal message intended for Angela. And whoever this Jason person was clearly knew personal details about her and her husband. The email, which was littered with biblical references, explained to Angela that Ian had been unfaithful to her and that he didn't love her and he never would. Jason also told her that Ian was going to harm her if she didn't leave him immediately. And the email closed by telling Angela that she and her husband had sinned against God. Angela stared at her computer screen for quite a while, wondering what she should do. Eventually, after reading it a few more times, she decided it had to be some sort of sick joke and that the best thing to do was just to ignore it. So she deleted the email, shut her computer, and she walked away. The next morning, Angela logged back onto her computer, and when she opened her email, there was a new email from Jason Ray sitting at the top of her inbox. Angela thought about not even opening it and just deleting it, but her curiosity got the better of her and she clicked it open. Once again, the message was aimed at trying to convince Angela to leave Ian. It was full of biblical references, and at certain points it didn't even make any sense. But there was a new twist to this email versus the one she had received the day before. In this email, the sender, Jason, clearly references Michelle, Ian's ex. Jason would write that Angela was Ian's Eve, and Michelle was Ian's Lilith. According to a particular interpretation of Jewish folklore, Lilith was the first wife of Adam from the famous Adam and Eve story. But Lilith was banished from the Garden of Eden for disobeying Adam, at which point God made Eve out of Adam's rib, and then Eve became Adam's wife. While somewhat confusing, the message Jason was sending Angela was fairly clear. Angela was not meant to be Ian's wife. Ian's true wife was Michelle. Angela didn't know anything about Ian's ex, Michelle. All she really knew was her name and that she existed. But despite the lack of insight into who Michelle was, Angela couldn't help but think, this email sounds an awful lot like something a deeply scorned lover would send. And so that night when Ian got home, Angela showed him the latest email from Jason Ray and told him, I think this is your ex, Michelle. At first, Ian was confused. He and Michelle had settled their issues. They had moved on, so why would she write this? But after reading the email a few more times and seeing all the over-the-top biblical language that Michelle had previously used in emails to him, he became convinced as well that this probably was Michelle. However, he told Angela that Michelle was very mercurial and that she must have just gotten worked up about something and she's overreacted. That's why she sent these emails, and she's likely to calm back down and they will never hear from her again. However, he told Angela if the emails do continue, please let him know and he would go to the police. For the next several days, Angela checked her email, but no strange emails came through. But roughly a week after that first Jason Ray email arrived, Angela received another email from Jason Ray, and this time the subject line simply said, die. The body of the message read, I hope you are scared of death tomorrow. Be prepared, don't sleep. Be watchful of the daughters of God. We will steal your child and we will watch as it dies. Within minutes of receiving this email, Angela received a barrage of others from Jason Ray, as well as from other account names she didn't recognize, like Lilith Truth. And all of these messages included the threat that Angela was going to be harmed in the coming days, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Angela was horrified and was starting to wonder if this really was something Michelle could be doing. It just felt so evil. Then she noticed at the bottom of one of the emails she had just received that it literally said, from Michelle. It looked like the signature had been automatically entered into the email template, and then Michelle must have just forgotten to delete it before sending. Or, as Angela and Ian stared at it and discussed what it could mean, they thought, well, maybe she left it in on purpose. Maybe she wants us to know this is from her. Either way, at that point, Ian and Angela felt fairly certain that Michelle was really behind this, and so they printed out all of the nasty emails Angela had received to date, And they took that along with the email Michelle had sent Ian the year before that was very biblical in nature. And they took all of that to the courthouse, and Ian would file another restraining order against Michelle. A few days later, on June 6th, 2 police officers went to Michelle's residence and literally handed her the order to appear in court for this restraining order. The date was set for June 17th. But that night, and over the course of the next several days leading up to this court appearance, Angela continued to receive dozens of emails from Jason Ray and Lilith Truth and other anonymous accounts threatening to make her pay for having filed this restraining order. Even though Ian told Angela that there was just no way Michelle was actually going to hurt her, Angela couldn't help but feel terrified and was afraid to leave the house. Finally, June 17th arrived, and Angela and Ian arrived at the court alongside a huge group of friends and family members who were there to support them. When Michelle walked in with her lawyer, she was met with boos and hisses from all of these supporters, and then once court was called to session, Angela and Ian outlined what had been happening over the last couple of weeks, and they showed the judge the stack of all these emails. The judge reviewed the documents and then turned to Michelle and asked her what she had to say for herself. And she would say, "I didn't send those emails. I don't know what's going on. I didn't do this." But the judge wasn't buying it, especially given the fact that Ian had previously filed for a restraining order against Michelle for threatening emails. And so this time, the judge did grant the restraining order, prohibiting Michelle from having any further contact with Ian or Angela. Angela and Ian were thrilled, and when they walked out of the courtroom, they felt confident that this nightmare was finally behind them. But within hours of getting home, Angela started receiving more emails, and immediately they contacted the Anaheim police to report that Michelle was already violating her restraining order. But since the emails they were receiving now were not signed by Michelle, there was no way for the police to prove that Michelle was in fact violating her restraining order. And so for several days, the ferocious, threatening biblical emails continued, and there was seemingly nothing Ian or Angela could do to stop it. Then, as if it wasn't stressful enough, Angela received an email from an account she had not seen before, inquiring about her rape fantasy request on Craigslist. Angela did not understand what this person was talking about, but eventually, when she went online and investigated, she discovered there was an entire marketplace of people posting ads on Craigslist seeking partners to take part in a rape fantasy. And someone had clearly been pretending to be Angela and was going into these places on Craigslist and responding to all of these ads saying that she, Angela, was interested. And then she would leave them her address and what she looked like and what her daily habits were like. And according to some of these men that were reaching out now to Angela, apparently whoever was doing this was indicating that Angela didn't just want to be a part of some basic rape fantasy. She wanted to be attacked out in public, and she was encouraging these men to follow her and stalk her and then attack her and rape her. And even if she tried to say stop, don't. Angela knew Michelle had to be behind this, but again, there was just no evidence tying these rape fantasy responses to Michelle because she wasn't signing her name to them. And so despite how absolutely horrifying it was to learn this was going on, there was nothing the police could do to stop it. For Angela, this was a nightmare. The stress and the fear of this situation was just so much that she basically just hid in her condo all day long. But on June 24th, so 1 week after the court appearance and just a couple of days after first learning about this rape fantasy ad, Angela had to leave the condo to go out and run a few errands. And so she gathered up her things and she called Ian, who was at work, to let him know that she was heading out in case anything happened to her. And then she left her condo. She went downstairs to the large parking garage underneath their development where residents could park their cars. She hopped in her car and she drove up the ramp out onto the street and then went about her day, running her different errands, and it was totally uneventful. At some point when she was done, she made her way back to the condo complex. She went down the ramp into the underground parking garage. She found her way back to her assigned parking spot. She parked. She got out of her vehicle. She shut the door and she began walking from her car to the door on the far side of the garage that would lead to the stairwell back up to her actual condo. But when she got maybe 30 feet away from this door, she heard movement coming from behind her. She turned around and she saw there was this man who she didn't recognize, who was walking very quickly toward her, and because she was already completely on edge, given all these threats she's been receiving, threats of bodily harm, threats of rape, she immediately screamed and started running towards this door that would take her to the stairwell. But before she could open the door and get inside, this man had lunged and grabbed her around the neck, and he was trying to pull her to the ground, and he was trying to pull her clothes off, and Angela began punching and kicking and screaming and biting, doing anything she could, and eventually she was able to fight this person off of her, and he quickly turned and ran away. And then Angela quickly picked up her stuff, she ran into the door, ran upstairs, got into her condo, and as soon as her door had shut and locked behind her, she picked up her phone and she dialed 911. And she was so hysterical that when she talked to the dispatcher, they couldn't understand what was happening, but eventually she was able to tell them what had happened and to please come out here and help her. And then a little while later, when the police showed up, they found Angela still totally hysterical in her condo. Her shirt had been ripped in half and she had red spots all around her neck from where this guy had grabbed her. But overall, she was okay. The police would search the building, but there was no sign of her attacker. However, Angela would tell police that she was fairly confident she understood what had just happened. She explained what was going on with her and her husband's ex, Michelle, and how despite this restraining order against her, she was clearly signing Angela up for these rape fantasies on Craigslist. And so most likely this man who had attacked Angela down in the garage was only there because of this rape fantasy ad. The police took down her statement, and then that night they would go to Michelle's residence and they would show her a search warrant that authorized them to search all of her devices, her phone, her laptop, all of them. And when Michelle turned them over and gave up all of her passwords, the police were able to find enough evidence that she was behind the harassment of Angela and Ian that they arrested her on the spot. Angela and Ian were relieved when they heard the news, and that night, while Michelle was in jail, the threatening emails completely stopped. However, the following day, Michelle posted bail, and within hours of her being free again, Jason Ray and Lilith Truth began bombarding Angela's inbox again. Angela was so distraught, she went to the doctor for a checkup, worried that her stress would negatively affect her pregnancy. And to her horror, the doctor would tell her that she had actually lost the twins. She had miscarried. And if that wasn't horrible enough, the doctor also discovered that her cervical cancer, which had been in remission, was now back. While Angela and Ian grieved the loss of their unborn children and wondered what they would do about Angela's cancer, the horrible emails continued. And men kept showing up at their front door, asking to come inside for violent sex with Angela. Finally, on July 13th, so roughly 2 weeks since Angela was attacked in the parking garage, Angela looked out of her window and she saw there was this young man kind of lurking on the side of their condo complex, and he appeared to be hiding. Worried this guy was going to ambush her as soon as she walked outside, she called the police. The police showed up and they spoke to the young man, who would confirm he was there because he was responding to a rape fantasy ad. He said the woman inside, Angela, had told him to come here and have his way with her. After this incident, Ian was completely fed up and he demanded the police do something about this. You need to go arrest Michelle and keep her behind bars. And sure enough, the next day, Michelle was arrested again. But this time, her bail was set for $1 million, making it impossible for her to make bond. Angela and Ian finally were able to breathe a sigh of relief, although they didn't know exactly what she would be charged with or what the legal outcomes would be. For the time being, so long as Michelle was in jail, they knew they were safe. Except Michelle was completely innocent. Yes, she did send that first fire and brimstone biblical email the year before in September, the one that led to Ian filing that first restraining order request that was denied. But after that, she had lawyered up and not had any contact with Ian or his new wife. In fact, the first time Michelle had ever even laid eyes on Angela Diaz was on June 17th when Michelle was in court for that second restraining order request against her, which caught her completely by surprise. She had totally moved on with her life at that point and was dating other people and focusing on school, so when she was asked to come in and defend herself in court, she barely knew what to say. It didn't make any sense. And then when Michelle was arrested for the second time and couldn't make bail and so had to just sit in jail till her court date, her family hired a lawyer to investigate and figure out who was actually behind the harassment, because it wasn't Michelle. And what their lawyer would discover was truly shocking. Every horrible, threatening email that was sent to Angela's inbox was sent by Angela. The rape fantasy ads on Craigslist? Angela. The supposed attempted rape attack on Angela in her parking garage? That was completely made up. It never happened. She made those marks on her neck. She ripped her clothes off. It had all been an elaborate setup by Angela and by Ian. They had been in on this together. At the time they launched this frame job of Michelle, they were only a few weeks away from that 6-month deadline that Ian had to either sell the condo and split the profits with Michelle or take over the whole mortgage. And apparently, Ian and Angela believed their plan would result in Michelle losing her claim to the condo, and their legal agreement around the condo would become null and void, thereby saving Ian from being forced to sell the condo or having to potentially pay a higher price for it. The pair were so convinced this plan was going to work that Angela even lied about being pregnant. It was all a ruse to make it seem like Michelle's harassment had led Angela to lose her pregnancy. She was also lying about having cancer. Michelle's lawyer quickly uncovered lots of these holes in Ian and Angela's plan, and finally, after Michelle had sat in prison for 89 days after that second time she was arrested, she was released. On Tuesday, October 17th, 2017, Angela Diaz pleaded guilty to 10 felony and 22 misdemeanor charges, including kidnapping, false imprisonment, and falsely reporting a crime to a peace officer. She was sentenced to 5 years in state prison. Ian Diaz was not charged with any crimes at the time and continued in his job as a U.S. Marshal. But 2 years later, on December 20th, 2019, Michelle filed a civil rights lawsuit against Ian, alleging that he was in fact the mastermind of the plot that resulted in her wrongful imprisonment. She also brought charges against the Anaheim Police Department for their failure to properly follow up on evidence they discovered early in the investigation that showed the threatening emails Michelle was accused of sending, in fact, originated from the Diaz household. On Friday, May 3rd, 2021, the Anaheim police announced they had reached an undisclosed cash settlement with Michelle, and then a little over a week later, on May 13th, Ian Diaz was arrested and charged the following day with 1 count of conspiracy to commit cyberstalking, 1 count of cyberstalking, and 1 count of perjury for his false testimony in a deposition in connection with a federal civil lawsuit. If convicted, Ian faces a maximum penalty of 5 years in prison on each of the counts. His case is still pending. Since her public exoneration back in 2017, Michelle has gone on to finish her MBA, she has left California, and she found a great job in marketing with a beauty company. In 2009, a fit, healthy 30-year-old man named Alex was at home in San Diego watching TV in bed. At some point, he noticed there was a slight pain in his left Achilles tendon. A tendon is the fibrous connective tissue that connects muscle to bone, and the Achilles tendon is the biggest tendon in your whole body, and it's the one you can feel on the back of your ankle. It connects your calf muscle to your heel. Alex had never had tendon pain before, and so he assumed it must just be tightness from the long walk he had taken that night around his neighborhood. And so after massaging it for a little while, eventually he kind of forgot about it and just kept watching TV until he fell asleep for the night. The next morning when Alex woke up, he immediately recognized that the pain in his left Achilles tendon was 10 times worse. It was blindingly painful, and then his right Achilles tendon was also now starting to hurt. And so he reflexively reached under the covers and tried to massage his sore tendons, but as soon as he touched the backs of his legs, he felt shooting pain in that area, and so he couldn't touch them anymore. And so instead, he swung his legs off the bed and he sat up on the edge of his bed, and then he slowly rocked forward until he transferred his weight onto his feet and tried to stand up. And as soon as he did, he fell to the ground because of the blinding pain in his tendons. And so he manages to pull himself back up using the bed, and then he hobbles his way out of his bedroom over to the top of the stairs, and then he grabs the railing and he carefully makes his way down the stairs. And as he's walking, it feels like the tendons are so tight, they're gonna snap like a rubber band. And so he gets to the bottom of the stairs and he walks his way around into the kitchen where he sits down and he kind of evaluates what's going on. And he thinks to himself, man, I must be developing a wicked case of tendinitis. Tendinitis is inflammation or irritation of the tendon. And so Alex grabbed his laptop, which was right in front of him. He opened it up and he began looking for ways to alleviate pain from tendinitis. And so after looking in a couple medical forums, he got up and hobbled his way over to the bathroom. He opened up the medicine cabinet and he grabbed the Icy Hot, which is a topical pain reliever. And then he hobbled his way into the first floor living room where he laid down on the couch. And then he applied a healthy amount of Icy Hot on the backs of both of his legs right over his tendons. And then he propped his legs up on 2 pillows. And so he laid there and he's thinking, okay, so it's the weekend. I have today off. I'll just lay here until the pain subsides. But by that evening, the pain had not subsided. It had gotten progressively worse. And so Alex picked up the phone and he called a podiatrist, which is a doctor who specializes in feet and the lower half of your leg. And he made an appointment for the following morning to have a look at his Achilles tendons. And so after he hung up, Alex thought to himself, the best thing I can do is probably just go to bed. I'm bound to feel better in the morning. And so Alex hobbles his way back up the stairs, holding onto the railing, and he goes into his bathroom to wash his face. He reaches for the towel, and he notices his thumb is suddenly locked up, and he can't move his thumb. And then his other thumb, too, locks up, and he's looking at them, and he can't get them to move. And so with his other fingers, he tries to move that thumb and bend that thumb, but he can't do it. The tendon in both of his thumbs had suddenly become unbelievably tight to the point where he couldn't move his thumbs anymore. Up until this point, Alex had convinced himself that whatever was happening with his Achilles tendons was probably minor, that with or without medical intervention, it was bound to just get better. But now he wasn't so sure, because the thumb situation, that really scared him. He had never experienced anything like that, and he couldn't help but think that whatever was happening in his thumbs was probably what was happening in his Achilles, making this a much more complex problem. So Alex forgets about washing his face or even going to bed, and instead leaves the bathroom and grabs the railing and hobbles back downstairs. He makes his way into the kitchen with the stiff thumbs, and he sits down at the table. He opens up his laptop, and he begins looking for any information about what is happening to him. A few minutes into his search, he was about to type something into Google when all of a sudden he felt the rest of his fingers start to lock up. The tendons in his fingers were tightening up just like his thumbs and just like his Achilles tendons. And so now Alex is going into crisis mode. He doesn't know what's happening to him. He has no idea what to do, but he manages to calm himself down, and he told himself, Alex, tomorrow you got a doctor's appointment. They'll know what's wrong with you. They will fix this. Everything's going to be just fine. And so despite his overwhelming urge to panic, he closes his laptop and he hobbles his way over to the stairs. He climbs up to the second floor and he goes directly into his bedroom, crawls in bed, and he goes to sleep. The next morning when he woke up, the tightness and pain in his Achilles tendons and in his hands had not gotten any worse. And that kind of comforted Alex. He's thinking, okay, we're past the worst of this. I just need to figure out what this is and then fix it. And so he crawled out of bed, he hobbled his way over to the stairs, he went down, he grabbed a quick bite to eat, and then he went outside to his car to head out to his doctor's appointment. When he got to his car, he reached for the door handle, and when he pulled on it, he felt an unbelievable surge of pain in the hand that was on the car. And when he looked down, all of the joints in that hand that had been pulling on the car, they had all separated, like the connective tissue that kept his finger whole was no longer strong enough. So Alex screamed and he retracted his hand in horror, and when he looked at it, the joints had gone back to normal, but the pain in this hand persisted. And so on adrenaline alone, Alex managed to use his other hand and got the car door open. He went inside, and then he could barely grip the steering wheel because one hand is now wrecked and his other hand is not much better. But he managed to speed to the doctor's office, and then when he got inside, he could barely fill out the paperwork because one hand was wrecked and the other wasn't much better, so he couldn't grip the pen. But after he gave them his paperwork, the doctor finally came out and they brought him back to an exam room, and that's when Alex explained that originally it was just his Achilles tendons. That's why he had called for this appointment. But after making that appointment, not only had the pain in his Achilles gotten much, much worse, but there was also now pain and tightness in his hands, including one hand that had just fallen apart when he tried to open a door. Alex told the doctor that he had never experienced anything even remotely resembling this in his entire life. He led a very healthy lifestyle and really had no idea what could be causing this. Although he did say 10 days prior, he had finished a round of antibiotics. The drug was called Cipro, but previously he had used this drug with no issues. But as a precaution, he told the doctor because he knew one of the side effects of this drug was tendon problems. And so as a precaution, Alex had actually brought the paperwork for that drug, Cipro, and he gave it to the doctor. And so the doctor, after hearing the story, he reads through the fact sheet of this drug, and he tells Alex that he doesn't think it's a side effect of the drug. He thinks Alex is showing all the signs of having an autoimmune disease, like lupus or multiple sclerosis, and that he needs to go to a rheumatologist and get tested for that. And so Alex is horrified by this. He can't believe that only a couple of days ago, he was totally normal, and now it felt like his whole life was falling apart. And so he left that appointment, he went out to his car, and he called a rheumatologist, and he set up an appointment for a couple of days later to get tested, and then he went home. And over the next couple of days, as he waited for that next appointment, his condition only got worse. Every muscle, joint, and connective tissue in his body was either extremely tight, or hurt, or both. By the time he made it to the rheumatologist's office, he could barely move on his own. After the doctor had run several tests on Alex began mentally preparing himself to be told that he had an autoimmune disease. He believed at this point that that was the most logical explanation for what was happening to him. But when the test results came back in, to Alex's shock, he was negative across the board. He did not have an autoimmune disease. And so Alex hobbled out of the office, he got out to his car, he sat down, and he was in pain and at a loss. He had no idea what was happening to his body, and it seemed like none of the experts knew either. And so when Alex got back to his house, he made his way into the kitchen and he sat down to do some more research, but he felt like he was at a loss there too. He didn't even know what to research. He had searched for every possible combination of pain, tightness in your Achilles, pain, tightness in your hands and your fingers, and nothing was lining up with his experience. And so he thought to himself, even though that podiatrist ruled out the antibiotic he had taken a cycle of before he started feeling the way he was feeling, even though he ruled that out, I might as well do some more research on it because it's the one thing I can point to that was newly introduced to my life before I had all these things happen to me. And so he opened up his laptop and he typed in Cipro side effects, and what he discovered horrified him. Cipro is part of a class of antibiotics called fluoroquinolones, and while it is a very effective antibiotic, it comes with extremely severe side effects. And enough people who have taken a fluoroquinolone have suffered from these side effects that there's actually a term given to them. They are said to have been floxed. And as Alex discovered in his research, there are many online communities for these floxed individuals, many of which used to be healthy and fit, but after taking these drugs, they became bedridden or had to transition to a wheelchair. This is due to one of the nastiest side effects of this class of drug, ruptured tendons. As a reminder, a tendon connects muscle to bone. And so if you were to say a tendon has ruptured, what you're actually saying is the muscle has torn off of the bone. And apparently, this is unbelievably painful and almost always requires surgery to fix. And in many of these floxing cases, the fluoroquinolone drugs cause these people's tendons to start dramatically tightening until they just start rupturing. And there's nothing they can do to stop it unless they stop moving, hence becoming bedridden and transitioning to wheelchairs. When Alex read all these horrible testimonials of people who had been floxed, he realized their experience mimicked his own. He was floxed. But once he knew what he was up against, he began looking for a timeline. How long would he have these symptoms for? And what he saw was most people experience these awful symptoms for about 3 months and then they fade away. So for 3 months, Alex suffered, but he stayed positive. He was certain he was going to get better. But 3 months came and went, and he didn't get better. In fact, he got worse. All of his tendons continued to tighten, and some of them ruptured, and he had to quit his job and had to move in with his parents. But he stayed positive. He went back online, and he began reading about more severe floxing cases, and he saw those people typically saw a big turnaround at the 3-year mark. And while that was overwhelming and awful and disheartening, he at least had something to look at as the light at the end of the tunnel. And so for 3 more years, he waited and waited in pain. He eventually became completely bedridden and completely dependent on his parents. But then the 3-year mark came and went, and much like the 3-month mark, nothing got better, he just got worse. And that was when Alex realized he was in the range of people that suffered from their floxing permanently. In 2016, so 7 years after taking that fateful dose of Cipro, he wrote a blog post on his website updating the world about his condition. In it, he says he's only gotten worse and that his life effectively came to an end in 2009 when over a 6-day period he swallowed those 12 Cipro pills. And so now all he looks forward to is his death. Our next story is called Traffic. In 2013, 46-year-old Paul Baxter started feeling sick, and then he developed a wicked cough that got so bad over a couple of days that he could barely speak because he was just coughing the entire time. And so he went to his doctor, who quickly diagnosed him with pneumonia and put him on a treatment plan. But after several months of being on this plan and not having his condition improve at all, his doctor referred him to a respiratory clinic. There, they did an x-ray of his chest and they discovered a suspicious shadow in the lower right section of his lung. Doctors were concerned, especially given the fact that Paul was a long-term smoker, but before they just put him under the knife and started cutting this out of his lung, they decided they would take a probe with a camera on the end of it and run it down into his lungs and actually have a look around inside. During the procedure, which Paul was awake for, the doctor put the probe down into that shadow area in his lung, and right away he saw this lump. But when he zoomed in with his camera on the lump itself, he saw there was something orange sticking out of it. And so he told Paul there were little pincers at the end of this probe, and he was going to try to move the tissue around to try to see what this thing was, and if it was a foreign object, he would try to pull it out. But when he tried to move around the tissue to get a better look, he couldn't get it dislodged, and so he pulled the probe out, and he told Paul he would need to come back in a couple of days when he could use a longer and more powerful probe. And so Paul looks at the doctor and he's like, well, what is it? What is this orange thing inside of my lungs? And the doctor said, honestly, I have no idea, but it's not supposed to be in there. A few days later, Paul went back in for this follow-up procedure, and the doctor, using this longer, more powerful probe, was able to go down and actually dislodge this orange thing from inside of his lungs. And as soon as he pulled it free, there was a camera screen that was watching in real time what this probe was seeing. And so Paul and the doctor and the other doctors that were in there as well all got to see for the first time what this thing was. It was this kind of triangular, small orange thing that nobody had seen before. And so as it was getting pulled up and out of Paul's body, everyone's just watching the camera, wondering what this thing is. And then finally, the pinchers came out of Paul's mouth, revealing what it was holding on to, and nobody could believe what they were looking at. What it was holding on to was a small plastic orange traffic cone from a child's play toy set. And as soon as Paul saw it, a memory came rushing back to him, and he told the doctors when he was 7 years old, he swallowed, or so he thought, a cone that looked an awful lot like this one, except he hadn't swallowed it, he had inhaled it. And then somehow, for 40 plus years, he'd had no symptoms related to it until now when he developed that cough. Paul would say when he had this revelation in front of the doctors, there was a moment of silence, and then everybody just started cracking up laughing because none of the doctors had seen anything like it before and didn't really know how to react to it. And so Paul was allowed to keep his traffic cone, and after he left, his cough went away and he went back to normal. The next and final story of today's episode is called 16 Minutes. In 2006, 73-year-old Sherman Sizemore was the definition of a man's man. He had spent the bulk of his adult life doing one of the most dangerous jobs in the world, mining for coal in West Virginia. And while he was a coal miner, he apparently had lost track of the amount of times he had nearly been killed from mine shaft collapse and gas leaks. Later on in life, after his kids had all grown up, he had retired from coal mining and become an ordained Baptist minister. And despite his harrowing backstory and burly, intimidating appearance, he was known to be incredibly gentle and very calming to his parishioners. He was also known to be an incredibly devoted grandfather, to the point where if there was a chance to spend time with his grandkids, he would basically throw all of his responsibilities out the window to do that. But in January of that year, something changed in Sherman. He went from being this pillar in the community to being a deranged, paranoid lunatic. It all started on the afternoon of January 19th. Sherman and his wife Ruby were sitting in their home alone on the couch, just kind of doing their own things, when suddenly, out of the blue, Sherman just starts screaming as if he sees something in front of him that's terrifying him, and his scream startled Ruby so that she started screaming, and so she looks at her husband, and he's still just looking straight out ahead. He's terrified of something in front of him, and so Ruby looks from him to where he's looking, and there's nothing there. And so she turns back to her husband, and she's like, "What's going on? What are you screaming for? What are you so scared of?" But Sherman wasn't able to speak. After he stopped screaming, he just continued to look straight out as if whatever had terrified him had him in this trance where he couldn't look away. And so his eyes are wide, his mouth is open, his face is going white, he's starting to sweat, and Ruby's starting to panic. She has no idea what's happening with him. And so eventually she just holds on to him and says, "Come back to me, come back to me." And Sherman at some point he kind of broke out of his trance, and he looked at his wife and he just says, "You can't leave me or they'll kill me." Ruby has never seen behavior like this in her husband ever. This is a completely different person she's interacting with, and so she has no idea what to do. And so instead, she just kind of holds on to Sherman and prays that he doesn't start acting like that again. But that didn't happen. All day long, periodically, he would just start screaming about something that Ruby couldn't see. Now, Ruby did consider calling 911 and getting medics out there, but his behavior was so unusual, and he was normally such a rock who was so competent, who was so healthy that she didn't want to. She felt like he would just kind of get through this, that if they can just get through today and get into tomorrow, that he would be better. And so she just all day was comforting him and just dealing with these episodes. And then finally they got into bed that night, and Ruby's thinking, "Thank goodness, we're going to wake up tomorrow and things will be better." But when she woke up the next morning, it was very obvious Sherman had not slept at all. He was looking straight up at the ceiling. He looked worse than the day before. It was obvious that he was not back to normal. And so Ruby called the rest of the family and had them come over to figure out what they were going to do. But when Sherman found out his family was coming to his house, he told Ruby they can't come inside. He was afraid they and others were conspiring to bury him alive. The only person he could be around was Ruby, and his whole family had no idea what to do. Little did they know, there was actually a very specific reason he was acting the way he was. A few months before January 19th, which was the day Sherman turned into this different person, a few months earlier, he began complaining of severe abdominal pains. And so he and his wife Ruby and his daughter, they went to the hospital, and the doctor, after examining him and running some tests, determined that most likely his pain was coming from his gallbladder. But the only way to be sure would be to do some exploratory surgery and literally look inside of Sherman's gut and look at his gallbladder and see if that was the problem. And so the doctor asked Sherman, are you prepared to do an exploratory surgery, or would you like to just kind of wait it out and see what happens with this pain? And so Sherman talked it over with his wife and his family, and they made the decision that the pain was just too much, and so they would go forward with the surgery. And so on the morning of January 19th, so again, this is the day that Sherman basically loses his mind, he goes into the hospital completely normal. He goes in with his wife, he goes in with his daughter, and he makes his way over to the surgery wing of the hospital. He says bye to his family, and he's put on a stretcher bed, and he's wheeled in and prepped for surgery, and then brought into the operating room. And while he was in the operating room, laying on his stretcher bed, flat on his back, looking straight up at all these bright lights above him, he just struck up some chit-chat with the nurses and doctors who were in the room, prepping the room for surgery, and they were also putting the IV into his arm. Then at some point, one of the nurses lowered the oxygen mask onto Sherman's face so the anesthesiologist could administer the 2-drug cocktail that would knock him out for the surgery. Sherman was scheduled to get something known as general anesthesia for this operation, where basically he would be completely out, he wouldn't feel anything, they'd do the surgery, and then he would wake up in recovery. And so once this mask was on Sherman's face, the anesthesiologist began pumping him full of the drugs that would make him be knocked out for the surgery. However, the anesthesiologist only administered one of the 2 drugs necessary for general anesthesia. He administered the paralyzing drug, but he did not administer the actual anesthetic that would knock him out, and most importantly, would get rid of all of his pain. And so as this mask is on his face and Sherman believes he's being given the proper dosage of drugs, the nurse who was nearby told Sherman to go ahead and start counting backwards in his head from 10, knowing full well that Sherman would pass out before he reached 0. And Sherman knew this too. He had been in surgery before, and so he happily began counting in his head. 10, 9, 8. He started to feel something. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Boom, he was out. Except he wasn't. When he reached 0 in his head, counting down, he realized he had not passed out. He began taking mental stock of what was going on, and he realized he could completely feel his body, but when he tried to move his body, he couldn't. He was completely paralyzed. When he tried to make a sound, he couldn't because his vocal cords were also paralyzed. The only thing he could move were his eyes. He could move them left and right. However, they had taped his eyes shut, so he can't see anything. And so Sherman is thinking to himself, okay, I've been given the drugs, maybe they're slow acting, any minute now I'm going to drift off to sleep and this will just be a distant memory. But after a few seconds, he's hearing the doctors and nurses in the room. He can't see them, but he hears them. They seem to be moving towards doing this operation, and he's still awake. And so Sherman becomes frantic and starts flicking his eyes left and right as fast as he possibly can. And the rapid eye movement actually loosened the tape on both of his eyelids, and it created a tiny slit that he could actually look through. And what he saw terrified him. The surgeon was walking over next to him. He was getting his gloves on. And then the surgeon says, "Scalpel." And the nurse hands him this chrome metallic blade. And the surgeon takes the blade and begins cutting into Sherman's midsection. Sherman felt everything, but Sherman couldn't do anything about it. All he could do was rapidly flick his eyes left and right in hopes one of them would see that he was awake, that he was feeling this. But no one was paying attention to his face, so they didn't see his eyes moving around. And so the surgeon continued to cut into his midsection until he had cut out a fairly significantly sized hole, at which point the surgeon hands the scalpel to the nurse and says, "Clamps." At which point the nurse hands him what looks like a torture device, and the surgeon proceeds to use these clamps to pin segments of Sherman's skin that has just been cut open to his body to basically keep the hole open. And then the surgeon began tugging on the outsides of this hole in Sherman's midsection, making sure it was big enough that he could actually get a good look into his body. And every little tug is sending lightning bolts of pain into Sherman's body. But again, all he can do is flick his eyes left and right, and no one's paying attention. Scope, the surgeon called out for, and the nurse handed him a camera that he jammed into Sherman's gut. And then the surgeon said, "Suction," and the nurse got what looked like a vacuum and pressed it inside of this open wound and began sucking out fluids from his body. The pain Sherman was experiencing is unimaginable. Every second felt like an eternity. Forceps, the surgeon called, and the nurse handed him these metal prongs that he put inside of this hole in Sherman's body, and he used them to dislodge his gallbladder so he could get a better look at it. By this point, Sherman wanted to die. He was no longer flicking his eyes left and right. He was just looking straight out, hoping someone would finally see him. And someone did. One of the nurses standing next to the surgeon looked up at Sherman's face and saw Sherman looking back, terrified at the nurse, at which point the nurse yelled out, "Stop, he's awake, he's awake!" And the surgeon practically faints, and he looks over at the anesthesiologist and he calls him, "Get over here and fix this." And so the anesthesiologist comes running over from the side of the room. He gets up next to Sherman and begins pumping him full of painkillers. And as he's doing this, he has this moment of clarity. He remembers he didn't give him the anesthetic. And so as these new painkillers that have just been introduced begin to take their effect, Sherman's eyes go from being terrified to glazed over, and he does pass off to sleep. And so now he's out and he can't feel anything. But now the anesthesiologist and the medical team realize they have a very big problem. This patient just experienced 16 minutes of surgery and felt all of it. And at the end of it, when he wakes up, he's going to remember it, and he's probably going to file a lawsuit against the hospital. And so a decision was made. It's unclear if the anesthesiologist acted alone or if the entire team was in on this, but regardless, the anesthesiologist administered an additional drug after giving all these painkillers. This additional drug was called midazolam, but it's better known as the amnesia drug. And like its nickname implies, anyone who gets it will forget what has just happened to them. And so the idea was by giving him this amnesia drug, he won't remember the trauma he had suffered through during the surgery, and so wouldn't file a lawsuit. And so after he was given this drug, the medical team, they went back to doing the surgery, they completed it, they got him back out to recovery, and then when Sherman woke up in recovery, he did not remember what had happened to him inside of the operating room, at least not consciously. those horrible 16 minutes had been implanted on Sherman's subconscious. Basically, his body recognized that he had experienced extreme trauma. However, the amnesia drug wiped away the memory of how he received that trauma. So there's this big disconnect in his memory. And so when Sherman came to in the recovery room, he immediately sensed something was horribly, horribly wrong. He was scared, he was anxious, he had this incredible sense of dread, but he had no memory to tie these feelings to. And so as Sherman is sitting in recovery, he must have tried to kind of hide the way he was feeling because he didn't even remotely understand it. He had been completely happy and normal going into the surgery, and now a couple of hours later, he's a complete mess. And so he leaves the hospital that day on January 19th. He goes back to his house and he sits on the couch with his wife. And as he's sitting there, suddenly these horrible feelings he's having, they become too much. And he basically has a panic attack and he starts screaming out and he's terrified of something, but he doesn't know what it is. And then over the next couple of days, he began having these flashbacks where he would access the actual 16 minutes of torture he went through. But when he would see someone cutting into him and opening his chest up and sucking things out of it, he didn't think that happened to me and that's why I feel this way. Instead, he thought it was just this horrible nightmare that he couldn't escape from. And so his family did eventually start getting doctors and psychologists and all these people involved to figure out what was wrong with him. But before they could figure it out, the whole situation had just become too terrible for Sherman. And so on February 2nd, just 2 weeks after he came out of that surgery, he would take his own life. His family was unbelievably heartbroken. It didn't seem real that this had happened. And so they would continue to dig and figure out what went wrong. And they would finally get their hands on the medical report from the gallbladder exploratory surgery on January 19th. And after giving it to another doctor to look over, this doctor discovered that Sherman had in fact experienced 16 minutes of something known as anesthesia awareness, where you are awake or feel a portion of your surgery. And shockingly, this happens to 20,000 people a year. However, Sherman's case, forgetting the amnesia drug, just literally what he went through, 16 full minutes of this really intensive surgery that he felt, that is an absolute rarity. That does not happen very often. Sherman's family would go on to sue the hospital, and they would be awarded an undisclosed amount of money from the hospital in 2008. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please gift the Amazon Music follow button one of those magic 8 balls that can tell the future, but change all the potential answers to, sorry, try again. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. We have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation that honors and supports victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.